everybody, welcome back to World History. We're going to be doing our first section for Chapter 18 today, so go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. Alright, so just like last chapter, and I'm going to move my little bubble up here, that way I'm out of the way, and you can see all the information. Each section for the notes for this chapter, again, will contain terms and people that you need to know. So I'll just leave these up here for a moment. You can just jot those down. We'll talk about a lot of these as we go through the notes today. Here's your next slide of those. And here's the last one of that. Okay, so our central question is what led to the storming of the Bastille and therefore to the start of the French Revolution? A volatile atmosphere in France resulted from widespread famine and influence of reformers inspired by Enlightenment ideas. The situation is going to explode on July 14th, 1789. Now, in 1789, France's society was based on a system created in the Middle Ages. The Ancien regime, or the old social structure, separated everyone in French society into one of three estates. Your first estate, which was the clergy, your second estate, which had the nobility, and your third estate, which was about 95 to 97% of the population, including the bourgeoisie, or the middle class, urban workers, and rural peasants. Now, the first two estates enjoyed a lot of wealth and privilege in France compared to the third estate. The church owns 10% of the land of France at the time. They collected tithes or religious taxes, which we've talked about previously, and they paid no direct taxes to the state. The nobility, on the other hand, had the right to top jobs in the government, the army, the courts, and the church, and they also paid no taxes, meaning the wealthiest portion of the French social structure wasn't paying taxes. It was all being placed on the lower classes of society. And at all levels, members of the Third Estate had a reason to resent the existing social order. Even wealthy members of the bourgeoisie did not have access to the best government positions because they were middle class. Urban workers earned pitiful wages and faced starvation whenever the price of bread rose. Literally, this is a period in time where in France we can talk about a number of bread riots, or people literally fighting in the streets for a singular loaf of bread. Rural peasants are also going to owe fees and services that dated back to feudal times. Going back to this idea of serfdom that we've kind of talked about a little bit in previous chapters, a lot of times those families are still stuck with the debt 200, 300, 400 years later. As the Enlightenment ideas spread among the Third Estate, many began to question the Ancien regime and were like, do we really need this? This isn't benefiting us. We should probably do something different. And it didn't help, on top of that, the economy of France was very much struggling. This added to the social unrest and heightened tensions. Years of deficit spending had put the government deeply in debt. Deficit spending is when you're spending money you really don't have. You're literally going into debt because of it. The money had been spent on Louis XIV's lavish court. Remember, we've talked about him back in chapter 16 and a little bit last chapter as well when we did the Enlightenment, about how lavish his lifestyle was, Versailles, all of those unique things that he bought. The 7 Years' War, where they lost to the British, supporting the United States during the American Revolution, we owed them a lot of money and we hadn't paid them back. And plus the rising cost of goods and services, coupled with bad harvests in the 1780s, made it harder to recoup this money. France was facing bankruptcy. So, to solve this crisis, the government had to increase taxes, reduce expenses, or in most cases, both. The first two estates resisted any attempts to make them pay taxes. Louis XV ran up more debt and left it all on his son, Louis XVI. Now, he was a pretty weak ruler, but he did attempt some economic reforms. He appointed Jacques Necker as his financial advisor, and Necker made some recommendations to reduce the debt, reduce extravagant court spending, reform the government, abolish tariffs on international trade so goods could get in at a cheaper price, and taxing the first and second estate, which these were not very controversial ideas, except for this very last one, tax the first and second estate. When Necker proposed taxing the first and second estates, the nobles and high clergy actually pressured Louis to dismiss him. They fired him because they did not want to pay taxes. Now, as a result of this, pressure for reforms was going to mount, but the powerful classes demanded that the king summon a meeting of the Estates General. This was the French legislature at the time. The nobles hoped that the Estates General could bring the absolute monarch under their control and guarantee their own privileges. At this point, they were only looking out for themselves. In the meantime, France was on the verge of bankruptcy. Rising prices, like I mentioned earlier, led to bread riots, and nobles continued to fight against taxes, whereas everybody else is struggling to eat and survive. Now, before the meeting, Louis had all the estates prepare cahiers listing their grievances. A cahier is essentially a notebook that people list out all the problems that they have. Some common ones: fairer taxes, freedom of the press, regular meetings of the Estates General. Many delegates from the Third Estate, which represented 95% of the population, wanted to solve the financial crisis, but insisted on reforms that would make it a little bit more fair for them. It's not going to go well for them. So the voting system created a stalemate because each estate traditionally met separately and had one vote. Meaning each vote, there was only 3 votes total. And more than likely, the first and second estate were going to vote together, meaning the third estate will lose every time. The third estate wanted to move to create a fairer system in which the 3 estates met together, and votes were counted by heads rather than estates. The first estate and the second estate did not want that because they were easily outnumbered. Now, in 1789 in June, after weeks of stalemate, members of the Third Estate declared themselves to be the National Assembly and the true representatives of the people. And they decided to go off and start doing their own thing and passing their own laws. Eventually, they will be locked out of their meeting hall and moved to a nearby tennis court. The members of the National Assembly took the tennis court oath, or essentially a pledge, to continue meeting until a constitution was established that benefited all of France. Now, shockingly enough, for as much pushback as they could have gotten, some reform-minded clergy and nobles actually joined the Third Estate in the National Assembly, and they forced Louis XVI to accept this new body of government, so the Estates General is gone. But when royal troops began to gather in Paris, rumors began to spread that the king planned to dissolve the National Assembly by force. So on July 14, 1789, the events are going to erupt into revolution with the storming of the Bastille, which was a fort/castle. A crowd gathered outside the prison to demand weapons they thought were stored there. The commander of the Bastille actually fired on the crowd, killing many. The mob then broke through, freeing the prisoners, but there were no weapons to be stolen. The fall of the Bastille challenged the complete existence of the Ancien regime and begins this entire period of revolution for the French. So that is it for today. There is no assignment for you this evening, so you do not have anything to worry about. So I will see you all next time. Bye, everybody.